Hi, everybody, and welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Judah Grunstein, WPR's editor-in-chief, and I'm joined by WPR managing editor, Freddy Deknatel. Hi, Freddy.
Hey, Judah.
We'll be talking about the latest developments in the COVID-19 pandemic, including President Donald Trump's surprise move to close the U.S. border to European travelers. Before we get started, just a quick reminder for everyone listening that the interview episode of the podcast went live Wednesday. Elliot spoke with Dina Esfandiari about the cascading crises facing Iran's leadership and how they're struggling to navigate them. Freddie, getting to this week's topic, it's clear from the developments since we last spoke about this that governments around the world are struggling to various degrees to keep up with the spread of the epidemic. We've seen some, so far, success stories when it comes to South Korea, for instance. Singapore is another one that I've seen mentioned. But countries that used very aggressive social distancing measures and regulations to battle the spread. And then, of course, obviously in China, it seems like the latest numbers suggest that the actual epidemic is tapering off in Wuhan and Hubei, the province where Wuhan is located and where this virus originated. But again, having used very aggressive measures to prevent the spread. And I guess as we see what's going on with government responses, we see this battle of narratives and instincts emerging. The instinct of openness and of closure, and the tensions between the Chinese model and how the Chinese responded, and the kinds of measures that are possible in the Western democracies or the developed democracies of Europe, the United States, and East Asia.
Exactly. I mean, I think that it's troubling to think that countries that are, not as wealthy, for example, as the United States, but are obviously still, developed economies. Most of all, I'm thinking of South Korea, have really outpaced the response so far, and if anything, have sort of showed what the model public health response should be. Mainly that there have been thousands and thousands, I think 150,000 maybe, tests so far of people in South Korea. The number may be higher now, I'm not sure. And the U.S. has obviously not gone in that direction. There's been a woefully low level of testing. I mean, it's almost staggering the level of under-testing here in the United States. If anything, it seems like what the U.S. government, what the federal government, what Donald Trump is trying to do and to claim that, that they're doing well is the kind of measures that you might see in China, which are very restrictive. Obviously, the U.S. is not moving to shutting down cities like the Chinese government did in Wuhan, at least not yet, but they are, pushing and most of their public health response so far and what they're trying to really take credit for are these, border closure measures, like first restricting flights from China and now restricting flights from Europe, although the full details of those European travel restrictions are still very confusing. The messaging around it between Trump's address to the nation and then subsequent cleanup, since he seemed to get a lot of the details wrong, are still sort of unraveling. But I think that, on the more restrictive side of things, we've already mentioned this before, but something like a global pandemic, which this now is, according to the WHO, this is not going to be stopped through, border closure measures of a virus of this kind of connectivity doesn't respect borders. It doesn't respect passports. It will spread just as every other, sort of globalized connectivity spreads, airports, airplanes, other forms of travel, the kinds of things that these measures will not, in fact, do much to prevent. And also, I think coming back to the example of South Korea, that rather than dealing with a problem that, Trump called it a, quote, foreign virus, rather than dealing with a problem as if it's somehow outside your borders. You realize that it's already here, and what needs to be done are aggressive mitigation and monitoring efforts in the country itself. And that's still what we're not seeing in the United States, that the virus is in the United States. If anything, we can be pretty sure that there are many, many, many more cases than the CDC has said, because, again, of the level of under-testing. And so I think that this tension, I'm curious to see how it unfolds in Europe, because obviously Italy has become really the next hotspot after China, and arguably more attention is on Italy, given how many cases have spiked there and the very troubling, rise in the death toll. And it seems like Italy, if anything, has sort of taken a little more of the sort of Chinese model in terms of shutting down things on a huge scale, trying to essentially quarantine a large part of the country. And I don't imagine that the rest of Europe necessarily will follow that model, but it does seem like there is this tension between these two different kinds of approaches.
Well, I was going to say, with regard to closing the borders, you hit the nail on the head. It's closing the barn door after the horse has already gotten out. The virus is already in the United States, so sealing off the borders at this point doesn't make that much sense. It does, at the same time, it's understandable as an emotional reaction. Now, again, you don't necessarily want your government leaders responding to emotional reactions in setting policy, but in a lot of ways, the pandemic that we're seeing clearly triggers all the fears that have led in the past few years to this emergence of a closure of the mind, whether in the U.S. or in Europe, this view of the outside world as a threat rather than an opportunity, this view of outsiders as a vector of contamination, and in this case, literally, with regard to the spread of this virus. So I think in that way, the virus is almost it's almost like the perfect agent to really activate all these fears that we've seen emerging over the past few years. I think with regard to Europe and with regard to Italy, there are a number of things going on. My sense, and again, I think it's important to say this for everyone listening, we're not medical experts. This is very serious stuff that we're talking about. We don't want to be alarmist or alarm people, but at the same time, it's gotten to a point where all the health authorities are really recognizing that this is a very serious crisis, and that in all likelihood, we're going to see it get worse before it gets better in the sense of it spreading. And again, the real challenge and the real priority right now is not necessarily to stop the spread, because I don't think that's possible, but to regulate it in a way that it doesn't necessarily spike in a short period of time. In other words, to stretch it out and to stretch the spread out over time so that the peak doesn't oversaturate and overwhelm treatment facilities like hospitals, intensive care units, and things like that. And so that's why you see what's happening in Italy. And it really, in many ways, I think, happened a little too late there. I think, in fact, that it's almost ineluctable right now in Europe, whether it's France, for instance, Spain, that they will start either encouraging or requiring the kinds of measures that we've seen in Italy. I think that there are a lot of equities that the policymakers balance in terms of not creating panic, for instance. There's also a huge strain that this sort of these kind of changes put on a society. So they really have to weigh those equities and figure out exactly what they're actually asking and requiring of the society as a whole. And as we're seeing now, exacerbated by this oil price war between the Saudis and the Russians, the economic consequences the pandemic are beginning to really be seen and become visible, and the societal consequences of that kind of quarantine in Italy is also becoming visible, where you have a lot of the wealthy people in the north, when the first quarantines were rolled out, they quickly escaped down to their villas in the Tuscan coast. And apparently there's a backlash there of people saying, no, go back to the north because you're now preventing us from being treated. So you see these kinds of issues that could come up within societies, within countries. We're seeing it among the EU countries who have really come up empty when it comes to offering solidarity and support for Italy, for instance, in terms of medical supplies. So I think that what we are really going to see right now is this question of solidarity and resilience within countries and among countries.
I had seen already here in the U.S. a story of sort of along similar lines. Obviously, the scale of the crisis is not anything like Italy here, but there was a story in Bloomberg about wealthy New Yorkers, because already here lots of people are working from home, and we here in the office at WPR, our office is now remote. We're all working from home. That wealthy New Yorkers have been apparently, at least some of them, leaving for their houses out in the Hamptons or their, country houses or weekend houses. And I do think that that's the kind of thing that you're going to see in the United States, especially, that this social distancing, a lot of the measures that the government, even if the federal government's messaging has been muddied, it's becoming more clear from private businesses, from even organizations like the NBA, which suspended their season, that everyone is getting the message that they need to, keep their distance, not go to large public gatherings. And people with the means obviously can do that in a way that is far less disruptive than, certainly people who can't afford to take a sick day, for example, or a lot of the issues that, in the U.S., what people are most afraid of is, this question of flattening the curve, which is the term I've seen used to describe what you were getting at about trying to control the spread of coronavirus so that it doesn't overwhelm the public health system. The worry here in the U.S., obviously, is that so few people, or there are so many people who don't have health insurance or can't afford to see a doctor and rely on just going to the ER to get any basic medical care, that's the kind of risk that if there is an Italy-style spike in cases here in the U.S., that the American healthcare system, given its high costs, and given just the major gaps still in people who do not have healthcare coverage, would be a bigger risk even still. There was some question, too, that I'd seen also, about the rush of Americans in France, for example, trying to buy tickets to come back to the U.S. Following Trump's address, even though it became clear that, in fact, the travel restrictions did not actually apply to Americans themselves. But it raised the question for myself that, if I was in Europe, I would probably, and I was an American there, I might consider staying in Europe, because you could probably rely on better healthcare coverage there, at least.
I was going to say that when you talk about the question of resilience in a country or in a society, and how societies resist the strain of these kind of collective upheavals, it does bring up this issue of competing models of social welfare, for instance, in terms of healthcare systems and in terms of social safety nets. A lot of the criticism in the U.S. of the European social democracies, for instance, is the way in which they do tend to constrain, let's put it that way, hiring and growth in some ways because of the high costs, the high cost for employers of payroll taxes and health insurance taxes and things like that. But it is at a time like this, you see the advantage of that. In France, for instance, there's paid sick leave. There's essentially universal health care with very low copayment, and a public health system that's extremely advanced and developed. And so, yes, when you compare that to, for instance, the American model at a time like this, it's definitely something that's enviable. And so I think that when it comes to the narratives that grow out of this crisis eventually, there will be this question of whether an authoritarian model like China has advantages compared to the sort of slow and messy processes that you see in democracies. So South Korea, from what I've read, is sort of an in-between where it's a democracy, but there's also still a much higher tolerance, let's say, of government presence, government surveillance, or knowledge of data and movement, and a kind of social controls whereby people are more willing to cooperate with restrictive measures, as opposed to the United States, where that kind of behavior is not necessarily part of the sort of social fabric or the societal DNA. But at the same time, then when you drill down within democracies, there will be these models of which of these social welfare models are preferable, and we've seen it play out, for instance, in the Democratic presidential primaries with regard to the left wing of the Democratic Party and the centrist wing, and how far to go toward universal health care, for instance, or social welfare benefits and things like that. I guess the question that comes up with regard to resilience too has to do with after the crisis is over. And I think one thing that should be clear is that this pandemic is probably going to have a very dramatic and in some ways unprecedented impact on our daily lives. At the same time, if we do manage to lower the curve, as you said, then it will eventually be contained. And it will have been destructive and traumatic in very many ways, but there will be a moment where we look back and say, okay, what went wrong? And from how I see things, I believe that that's also an area where the democracies have greater resilience than an authoritarian model like China, because we already see the ways in which China is whitewashing the narrative of how it addressed and responded to the crisis. Whereas, again, hopefully, in a democracy like the United States, the record will come out. It will become the truth will become a matter of public record, and people will be held responsible by the voters and by the public. And I think that that's something that even if it doesn't necessarily stave off the peak of the crisis, or if it might come too late to have prevented the crisis, it is an element of resilience in the long term for learning from the crisis in order to prevent it from reoccurring in the future.
Right. It's a good point. I think that, already we've seen in the case of China, there's been this sort of, coverage to a point to say that, China has responded, since the worst of the outbreak there, that the Chinese response has been effective, but obviously it has come with its own costs in terms of, the kinds of severe restrictions that an authoritarian government like China can do, because there's very little public resistance, but that isn't necessarily, the model that other countries should be following. And also, as you said, already we're seeing the Chinese leadership try to whitewash the early mistakes that were made, but also use the ultimately better response that it finally got around to doing as a sign of the sort of genius of the Communist Party. It's just become another propaganda tool, and this was something that I know Howard French, one of our columnists, pointed out a few weeks ago already, in terms of looking at the Chinese response. And then in his piece, his column this week, looking at in his words, the shambolic U.S. response to coronavirus, that, the troubling signs that just a few weeks ago, many American commentators were sort of, openly criticizing the Chinese response with the sort of subtext that, that could never happen here. And then as we're seeing, mainly in large part because of Donald Trump and the White House's own incompetence, that It's obviously not exactly the same situation, but there are very troubling similarities in terms of contradicting public health experts, essentially lying to the public about facts, which is something that the Chinese authorities did early on and something that Trump himself is still doing. That there is this sort of troubling, idea of, what can happen here, or that can never happen here, and that these sorts of either governance models or ability to respond to a public health crisis like this, it doesn't really necessarily respect political models or different systems of government. That what it really comes down to is competency and basically transparency. And I do think that that's something that you do see so far in the countries that are more effectively handling this. The German Chancellor Angela Merkel saying that she thought that Germans should prepare for the fact that something like 2/3 of the country could eventually be could contract the coronavirus. Donald Trump would never say that, because he would just be too afraid of the political or more likely economic consequences of saying that. But that's what you need leaders to say at this time, not to induce panic in people or to make people hysterical, but just to be very level-headed and clear, since that is what experts are saying, that the high end of risk could be that bad. So people just need to be able to know what is in front of them.
It's definitely a humbling moment to be American. And again, it's a selective memory as an American, right? To think that the U.S. represents competence and expertise and global leadership. I remember at the time of Hurricane Katrina, when I was in France, and people just coming to me incredulous, like, how could this be happening in the U.S.? And that was 15 years ago. The global financial crisis was another moment that, from what I've read, had a major impact on the Chinese leadership, for instance, in terms of their time frame for when China would become a global leader, and the global financial crisis being a moment where the American model was sort of debunked because of how American policy really led to that. But as selective as that memory it is, as an American, we do, speaking for myself, I do take pride in the idea that the American government and that America is often a leader in terms of this kind of crisis, is often a model for best practices and things like that. And clearly, that's not the case here. I think you do see in the U.S. at least a lot of local governments and state governments that are really taking the lead and filling the vacuum. But it does show the degree to which the federal government in the U.S. and especially a prepared executive is really essential in this kind of crisis. And over the past 5 years or so, in the lead up to Donald Trump's election, this whole backlash against expertise and against technocratic government, for all the failures of technocratic government, but a backlash against it, this idea that we don't need these seats filled at the table and we don't need to listen to the experts. Clearly, this is a crisis where that sentiment, the cost of that sentiment becomes really clear. I guess my final thought is to just really encourage everyone listening that in a lot of ways, the kinds of resilience that we're talking about can be individual actions and individual gestures, and that each individual can be a model for behavior and can be a model for resilience and for solidarity. And I guess just a reminder again, with the caveat that I'm not a medical expert, but from everything that I've read, for most of the people, when you mentioned that Angela Merkel had said that 2/3 of Germany will contract the virus, whether in Germany or the US or the UK or France, for most of those people, it will not necessarily be a life-threatening illness. But all of these changes in how we go about our daily life are really just acts of solidarity for the people who are very vulnerable to the virus. So it's a question of thinking civically in terms of solidarity and resilience. And so as much as it generates this anxiety and this fear, it's important to underline that really what we're talking about is changing behavior out of solidarity with the people who might be more vulnerable than I particularly am, or you. And there might be listeners who are particularly vulnerable. And so for them, for those people, that's what these changes are really about, is those gestures of solidarity to protect them.
Yeah, it's also just a reminder of how, fundamental these community relationships and just communities in general are, even at a time of, on the one hand, the virus is spread, as we've mentioned, is a, reflection of globalization and just how interconnected the world is. I was listening to something recently about, comparing this to the spread of SARS earlier in the earlier mid-2000s, and even the change in that period of time, 10 or 15 years, is dramatic. The world is even more interconnected now than it was then, and that partly explains the spread now. But it also just is a reminder that, all of this still comes down fundamentally to communities and localities, and a lot of the measures about people self-quarantining and people, limiting their exposure to other people, as you said, for the community benefit, maybe not necessarily for your own health, but to protect other people's health, that those are measures that, predate globalization, obviously, and that these are very sort of, old lessons about how to deal with outbreaks, how to deal with potentially new illnesses. I think it's been interesting to read about, some of the quarantine measures that go back hundreds of years that really aren't that different right now in terms of the sort of methods that people are adopting in terms of, isolating themselves. Obviously, there are, of course, many more significant medical advancements, but, just on that fundamental level, it isn't, rocket science.
It's counterintuitive, but in a lot of ways, the solution is a collective solution. It's even self-isolation is a collective response, and the solution comes from trying to think collectively and to work in the collective toward the collective good, and to not sacrifice connectivity in doing that, even if we might limit contact in the meantime. So it's counterintuitive, and in some ways might seem like a paradox, but like many paradoxes, you can have two things that seem to contradict each other, but they're also both in some ways very profound truths. Again, a very serious topic with a lot of ramifications for all of us. But I think it's also important to keep morale up and to remember that we as a society and as a global society have the resources and the resilience to tackle it and to come out on the other end. All right, time to mention some WPR articles for everyone listening. Freddy, which one did you have in mind?
Frida Giddis's column that covers something you briefly mentioned earlier in the conversation about Saudi Arabia's oil showdown with Russia, mainly to protect its share of the global oil market earlier this week, even though global demand has plummeted because of the coronavirus outbreak. Frida looks at how this is the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's latest brazen and probably quite reckless move. It's a very risky bet that comes at great cost to Saudi Arabia, like many other moves that MBS, as he's known, has taken in the last few years since he emerged basically as Saudi Arabia's de facto ruler.
And I'll mention this week's in-depth article by Kate O'Neill on the global war against plastic. In the space of a generation, plastic has gone from being the ultimate material of convenience to being perceived as a dangerous threat to the health of the planet and its inhabitants. As Kate explains, efforts to promote the recycling of plastics have largely been ineffective. Now, activists and governments, especially at the local level, are putting more of an emphasis on reducing the production and use of plastics, particularly through bans on single-use products like shopping bags and plastic cutlery. One of the statistics that jumped out at me from the article was that only 8.4% of discarded plastics enter the recycling stream, and not even all of that ends up being recycled. But on a more positive note, Kate suggests that unlike the climate crisis, quote, there appears to be enough political will to address pollution from plastics, and technologies are starting to scale up that will make a difference, unquote. All right, two things I want to mention before we get to the Who Said That segment. First, if you'd like to stay up to date on everything we cover at WPR, go ahead and sign up for our free daily newsletter at wpr.pub/trendlines. In addition to free access to selected articles all week long, you'll also get a promotional code for a 25% discount on a WPR subscription. Again, the URL is wpr.pub/trendlines. And second, if you'd like to drop us a line with questions or comments, you can email us at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. All right, time for Who Said That? Freddy, what do you got for me?
All right. You may not get the specific person who said this, but the subject or general context would be good enough. We had some very critical people who did not have security clearances who could not go. These should not be classified meetings. It was unnecessary.
I'm going to say it's the Trump administration's decision to classify some of the meetings of the coronavirus task force.
Yes, exactly. This was, and this will hopefully be, as you were saying, some of the details that are already coming out about this bungled U.S. response that, the public knows about already, and hopefully that there will be accountability for.
All right, here's mine. I'm sure that together we will do many more great things, at least until 2024. Then we'll see.
Oh, I don't know. I'm thinking of a couple different possibilities with elections, but I'm not sure.
That's Russian President Vladimir Putin in a speech to the Russian Duma just before legislators passed a law that would reset the counter on his term limits to 0 to allow him to run again in 2024 if he so decides. The measure still needs to be approved by the Constitutional Court. Putin recently announced all sorts of constitutional reforms and measures that people were trying to parse to see how he might try to sneak around the term limits and still hold on to power. And after all that ink was spilled, he just went ahead and reset the counter.
I was going to say, it's only a matter of time, I imagine, until Trump tweets something about wishing he could do the same here.
I'm sure he does. All right. Great stuff, Freddy. Thanks.
Thanks, Judith.
If you'd like to stay up to date on everything we cover at WPR, go ahead and sign up for our free daily newsletter at wpr.pub/trendlines. In addition to free access to selected articles all week long, you'll also get a promotional code for a 25% discount on a WPR subscription. And if you'd like to send comments or questions, email us at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. Trendlines is produced and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow him and World Politics Review on Twitter, and you can find links to pieces covering the issues we talked about in the show notes on worldpoliticsreview.com. Have a great weekend, and see you next week for 2 new episodes of Trendlines.